Cheers, guys. What are you doing while watching? Just relaxing or multitasking? Let me know.
My brother has always had what our parents called a short fuse, like it was some charming quirk, like biting your nails or forgetting where you parked. But what they really meant was, he had a temper and the rest of us had to adjust ourselves around it. For as long as I can remember, Derek was the one who got to break things, scream at people, slam doors, and punch holes in drywall, while the rest of us were told to stay calm, to not provoke him, to be the bigger person. And for years, I did exactly that. I swallowed the bile every time he took something from me, my toys, my privacy, even my sense of safety in our own house. And I told myself, that's just Derek, because that's what they told me to say. That's what they needed me to say, to keep the fantasy going. I remember being 11 when he borrowed my birthday money and never gave it back. I was too scared to ask. Our dad laughed and said, "He'll pay you in other ways," whatever the hell that meant. At 16, he wrecked my first car, a rusted little Corolla I bought myself with part-time job money because he wanted to take it for a spin, and decided to race a buddy in the rain. He walked away without a scratch and without consequences. I walked to school for the next 6 months, and then there was the time he got into trouble with the cops, something about shoplifting and resisting an officer, but it disappeared before I could even find out the full story. "It's handled," our dad told me. "He's under a lot of pressure." I was in college then, trying to finish a portfolio that could land me real freelance gigs, while Derek bounced from job to job and home to home like a pinball nobody could catch, except when he needed money or a place to crash. So when I say my brother smashed my laptop, I don't mean it was a one-off thing. I mean it was the final straw in a haystack, built over 3 decades of letting it go. It happened on a regular Tuesday night, and the only reason I was even in that room was because my mom begged me to come by for dinner. She said she missed me, wanted to reconnect, and promised it would just be the 4 of us, like old times. That should have been my first clue to say no, but I said yes because I still believed, stupidly maybe, that things could be different. Dinner started fine, fake smiles and surface-level updates. Derek was already 2 beers in by the time I got there, and by the time we sat down, he was holding court, talking nonsense about how the system is rigged and nobody respects real men anymore. I bit my tongue until he said something about how women milk mental health for attention, and I couldn't help myself. I snapped back. I told him he had no clue what he was talking about, and maybe he should read a book before spouting crap. He stood up, I stood up. Our dad told me to sit down. Our mom said, "Please not again." And then Derek, eyes wide with that blank, empty anger I've seen too many times, walked around the table, grabbed my laptop from my open bag, and hurled it against the wall like it was garbage. It hit the floor with a hollow crack, screen first, followed by the kind of silence that burns your ears. I stood there frozen, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I knew what they were going to say. And I was right. My mom covered her mouth like she was the victim. My dad turned to me, not to him, and said, "Melissa, please let it go. He was just angry." Not, "I'm sorry, commit guy," not, "he'll pay for it," just, "let it go." Something inside me snapped then, but it wasn't rage. It was clarity. That was the moment I realized I had spent my entire life being the reasonable one, the one who absorbed the shock, the one who held the family together by keeping quiet. But I wasn't going to be that person anymore. I nodded, calm as hell, and said, "Okay." And then I added, just as casually, "I already filed a claim in small claims court." The room went so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. My dad's jaw clenched. My mom's face dropped like I'd stabbed her. Derek blinked, like he couldn't process what I'd just said. And I just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for someone, anyone, to realize that for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to fold. I wasn't going to sweep this one under the rug. And maybe this is the part where you're thinking, it's just a laptop, right? Why go to court over that? But let me ask you something. If someone kept stepping on your boundaries over and over, and everyone you loved told you to smile through it, When do you finally say, enough? Let me know in the comments. Was I wrong to take it to court? Or was it about damn time someone in that family faced a consequence? Because the truth is, I wasn't doing it for revenge. At least not entirely. I was doing it for the little girl who got her money stolen, for the teenager who walked to school in the rain, and for the woman who had to fight tooth and nail for her career, while her brother coasted through life like the world owed him something. And that right there was the beginning of the end. The funny thing about family silence is how loud it can be. You grow up in a house where people raise their voices at the slightest inconvenience, where anger is thrown around like confetti, where your brother can smash furniture, curse through dinner, or storm out for hours, and nobody blinks. But the moment you decide to do something that isn't soft, submissive, or silent, the room doesn't erupt. It implodes into quiet judgment. Stretched so tight, it hums like electricity in your ears. That's what I walked into after I told them I'd filed the claim. No one screamed. No one fought me. Instead, they did what I've now realized is their go-to move when I become inconvenient. They acted like I'd broken some unspoken pact, and the punishment was isolation disguised as concern. The day after the dinner, my dad emailed me. Not a text, not a call, but a 3-paragraph message with the subject line, a request. He started by saying he loved me, which already set off alarm bells because my dad, a man who thinks therapy is for people who can't handle life, doesn't throw around emotions unless something needs to be fixed quietly. He asked me to reconsider the legal route, said it wasn't in the spirit of family, and reminded me of how Derek had always struggled to control his emotions. He didn't mention the laptop once, not the data, not the work I'd lost, not the cost. Just Derek's struggle, as if that explained everything, as if that made it okay. My mother didn't email, she texted. One line, "Can we talk? I'm worried about what this is doing to us." That's all. Not "how are you," not "I'm sorry this happened." Just a veiled guilt trip, a coded plea to fall back in line. Derek? Total radio silence, not a single word. Which didn't surprise me, honestly. He's never had to explain himself because someone's always done it for him. Whether it was my dad stepping in at school when Derek got suspended, or my mom smoothing things over with ex-girlfriends he'd scared off, there was always a buffer. But now there was a court case, something official, something public. And it rattled them more than I expected. I started getting quiet messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. An old cousin messaged me on Facebook with a vague, "Hey, heard about what happened. Hope you're okay." Another friend from high school, who still lives in town, reached out and said, "Your brother's got a reputation, always has." She said it like it was common knowledge, and maybe it was. Maybe I'd been the only one trying so hard to keep the family from falling apart that I never looked at what was already broken. I spent the next few days gathering everything I could to support my claim. I had the receipt for the laptop, screenshots of texts with my clients confirming projects I could no longer deliver, and photos of the shattered device. The more I dug in, the less it felt like revenge and more like recovery, like patching up a version of myself that had been frayed around the edges for far too long. And in the process, I started remembering things I'd buried. The way Derek used to yell at me if I had friends over, how he once read through my private journal and laughed about it in front of our cousins, the time he stole my debit card just to see if it worked. Every single incident had been brushed off. He was a boy, he was impulsive, he had problems, and I was expected to be the one who understood, who forgave, who sacrificed peace for harmony. It was during one of these long, quiet nights, sitting with open court forms on my kitchen table and an old mug of cold coffee beside me, that I decided to dig deeper. Not because I was looking for more dirt on Derek, but because something felt off. I remembered whispers from years ago, rumors I'd never taken seriously. One in particular stood out. A friend of his, back when he was in his early 20s, had once told me Derek got into some legal trouble, but it had gone away. I thought it was typical small-town gossip. But now, I wanted to know more. I pulled up public records. Most of what I found was boring. Traffic tickets, minor stuff. But then I saw it. A sealed case, dated 14 years ago, listed under his name, but with minimal information. It didn't say what it was for, only that it had been expunged. Sealed cases don't get sealed for speeding or parking violations. You don't wipe the slate clean unless there's something worth erasing. And I sat there staring at that screen, wondering how many people in my family knew about it and chose not to tell me. That's the moment I realized the silence wasn't just about the laptop. It was about all the other things they didn't want anyone to know, least of all me. They weren't trying to protect Derek from the consequences of one night's bad decision. They were trying to protect the whole myth of who he was and what kind of parents they were. If I went through with this case, it would put a crack in that story. Maybe not enough to shatter it, but enough to let the truth leak in. And that terrified them more than anything else. So I kept going. I filed the official documentation, paid the court fees, and waited for the hearing date. And every day that passed, the house stayed quiet, the phones didn't ring, and the people who once leaned on me for support disappeared like smoke. They didn't know how to talk to someone who didn't want to keep secrets anymore. But I had no intention of staying quiet. Not this time. Because silence, I'd learned, is just another form of control, and I was finally ready to break it. There's a moment in every dysfunctional family where the mask slips, where the pretenses of civility and mutual respect collapse under the weight of everything no one ever said out loud. And when my mother called and invited me over for what she called a peaceful sit-down, just to talk things out like adults, I should have known that what she really meant was, we're going to corner you, we're going to shame you, and we're going to try, one last time, to make you play your old role as the peacemaker, the silent one, the one who absorbs the dysfunction without complaint. And yet, despite everything I knew, I agreed to go, not out of hope, but out of a morbid kind of curiosity. The same feeling you get when you know a storm is coming, but you still step outside just to see how dark the sky gets. I arrived 15 minutes late on purpose, not because I was trying to make a point, but because I needed those extra minutes to steady myself, to remind myself of what I'd already survived, and to make sure that no matter what they threw at me, I wouldn't let them shake me again. I walked in with my hair pulled back, court papers tucked neatly into my bag, not to brandish like a weapon, but to remind myself that I had taken action, that I wasn't just reacting anymore, that I was doing something concrete to reclaim my time, my work, my dignity. What I didn't expect was to see Derek already there, slouched on the living room couch like he'd been there all day, one leg crossed over the other, arms sprawled like he owned the place, sipping a soda like this was just any other lazy afternoon and not the aftermath of him destroying my property. My mom came bustling in from the kitchen, fake cheerful, the kind of brittle energy she always carried when she was trying to glue everything back together with casseroles and nervous smiles. She asked if I wanted something to eat. I said no. She asked if I wanted tea. I said no again. My dad was already seated in his recliner, expression unreadable, arms crossed, as if he were the one bracing for an attack. No one mentioned the laptop. No one mentioned court. It was as if we were all pretending this was a normal family gathering. That illusion lasted about 2 minutes. Then my mom sat down, folded her hands, and said, "We all want the same thing, Melissa. We want to fix this." I laughed, not out loud, not hysterically, but just enough for them to notice the curve of irony in my mouth. Because if they had truly wanted to fix anything, they would have started 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago, when the fixing could have been something other than damage control. Instead, she kept talking, stumbling through some rehearsed speech about family unity, about how we've been through so much and how Derek has made mistakes but is trying. And then Derek himself chimed in, voice low and forced, saying, "Look, I didn't mean to break it. I was pissed. That's not an excuse. I get that. But it's just a laptop, Mel. Just a laptop." The words hit me harder than I expected, not because they surprised me, but because they didn't. Because of course he thought it was just a laptop. Of course he couldn't imagine that inside that laptop were 2 years of design work, client contracts, tax documents, personal journals, drafts of pitches, and a whole digital ecosystem of the life I had built for myself without ever asking anyone in that room for a damn thing. Of course he didn't care, because he never had to understand the value of anything he didn't pay for, work for, or build himself. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in my life, I saw a man who would never change, not because he couldn't, but because no one had ever required him to. And then I looked at my parents, who were watching me like I was the unpredictable one, the unstable element in the room, and I felt something in me cool to ice. "I'm still going to court," I said, clearly, without raising my voice. The reaction was instant and exactly what I expected. My dad stood up so fast his chair squeaked, face red, jaw clenched, voice raised, not shouting, but that deep, slow angers that men like him use when they think authority alone should be enough to win the argument. He said I was overreacting. He said I was putting the family through hell over a material object. My mom started to cry, real tears this time, because she always cries when control slips through her fingers. Derek just rolled his eyes and muttered something about how I've always been dramatic. It wasn't a conversation, it was a performance. And every role was cast the same as always, except mine. And then, as I gathered my things to leave, resolved not to give them the satisfaction of a meltdown, something unexpected happened. My aunt, my dad's sister, who had arrived sometime during the yelling without me even noticing, stepped into the hallway, took my arm gently, and whispered, "You're doing the right thing. I've kept quiet too long. Don't let them shut you up." I froze, because in that moment, I realized I wasn't just standing up to Derek. I was standing up to a whole history of silence, to a legacy of women in our family who had bitten their tongues raw trying to keep peace with angry men and smiling enablers. And my aunt, who had always been polite and distant, was suddenly this quiet witness, someone who saw everything and was finally acknowledging the truth out loud. I left without another word, drove home in silence, and sat in my parked car for almost an hour, staring out into the night, thinking not about the trial, not about the laptop, but about how many other people were living in that same house of silence, and what it would take to finally burn it down. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It never really had been. The courthouse wasn't grand or intimidating like the ones you see in legal dramas or polished documentaries, but something about the blandness of it, the chipped beige walls, the flickering overhead lights, the silence broken only by the shuffle of papers, and the occasional distant ring of a phone, made the whole thing feel strangely more serious, as if the very dullness of the environment emphasized how real, how utterly unembellished this moment was. It was happening, not in a storm of family arguments or teary living room standoffs, but in a quiet government building with rules, forms, and consequences, something my family had avoided their entire lives. I sat in the waiting area 30 minutes before the hearing, dressed simply but professionally, laptop bag over my shoulder even though there was no laptop in it. Just a quiet reminder to myself of why I was there. I had all the paperwork in order, the receipts for the laptop, the email from my client who had to pull the project due to missed deadlines, the photos of the smashed screen, and even a printout of Derek's text from months before, where he casually joked about popping off and breaking SHT when people get mouthy. It wasn't a threat, not directly, but it painted a picture of a man who didn't see damage as something serious, and certainly didn't think consequences applied to him. When Derek walked in, I was already seated. He came alone, without a lawyer, in jeans and a hoodie like this was an errand he was annoyed about rather than an official legal proceeding. He didn't look at me right away, but I saw his eyes flick in my direction once, quickly, like he was trying to size up how far I was willing to take this. And I knew down to the soles of my shoes, that he hadn't believed I'd actually go through with it, that this was all just some bluff in his mind, some temporary tantrum I'd throw before inevitably crawling back to keep the peace. The judge, a stern-looking woman with short hair and a voice like gravel, called us in 5 minutes past the scheduled time. She didn't smile, didn't ask how we were doing, just got straight to the point. She asked for evidence. I provided it. She asked for Derek's side. He said he didn't mean to break it, that we were arguing, and that he just lost his temper for a second. No apology, no offer to replace the laptop. Just a vague admission wrapped in self-justification, as if the court should factor in how annoying I must have been to deserve that kind of treatment. The judge listened patiently, occasionally jotting something down, and when she finally spoke, it was with that calm authority that makes you realize you're not in a family anymore. You're in a system that doesn't care about who's the golden child or who cried harder at Thanksgiving. She said plainly that the evidence showed Derek had destroyed my personal property, that emotional provocation was not a valid legal defense, and that I was entitled to compensation for the damages and the missed work that followed. She awarded me $800, not a fortune, not a symbolic triumph, but enough to make the statement that what happened wasn't okay, that it wasn't just a moment of anger, and that someone was finally holding him accountable. And yet, when the ruling was made, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet, not empty exactly, but sobered, like I had finally stopped expecting something that was never going to come. There was no apology, no remorse, no crack in Derek's face to suggest that anything had landed. He looked irritated, like the inconvenience was the real injustice, like he was the one who had been dragged through something unfair. And in that moment, I understood something that had been flickering in the back of my mind for weeks. That Derek wasn't just protected by our parents. He was addicted to the insulation, so used to getting away with everything that he now saw resistance as betrayal, not justice. Word of the hearing spread faster than I thought it would. A week later, I started getting messages, not just from family, but from people in town. An old high school acquaintance messaged me to say she once dated Derek briefly and ended things because of how fast he lost his temper. She never told anyone because, well, who would believe her when he was just angry? Another, a former neighbor, said Derek had once kicked a hole in his garage wall during an argument, and my dad had paid him cash not to report it. The stories piled up like a slow avalanche, and I started to wonder how many people had stories like mine. Little damages, paper cuts that added up over years, all quietly tucked away because confronting them would mean confronting a whole structure built on denial. My parents didn't call right away, which surprised me. I thought they might reach out immediately, try to smooth it over, but instead there was silence, chilly, deliberate silence that said more than any angry voicemail ever could. When they finally did reach out, it was my mother who called, voice low and fragile. She didn't ask how the hearing went. She didn't even ask how I was. She simply said, "Your father and I have talked, and we think it's best if you don't come to Thanksgiving this year. There's too much tension, and we want peace." Peace. That word again. Peace, the thing I was always expected to create by shrinking, by folding, by taking the hit and smiling through it. Peace that meant silence. Peace that meant don't rock the boat, don't hold anyone accountable, don't change the narrative. I said nothing for a few seconds, just held the phone to my ear and listened to the quiet behind her breathing, the kind of quiet that used to make me feel guilty, but now just felt like space I didn't need to fill. "Okay," I said finally, and hung up. No anger, no begging, just release. That night, I opened my email and found a message from one of my clients, someone I thought I'd lost after the incident. She said she'd heard about what happened from a mutual contact, and that she admired how I handled it. She offered me a new project, bigger than the last, more responsibility, better pay. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something settle in me, not satisfaction, not revenge, but something steadier. Because this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about finally stepping out of a story I didn't write. Thanksgiving came and went like a season you once cared about, but had long since outgrown. Quietly, without fanfare, without the obligatory stuffing and strained laughter over cranberry sauce, without my mother's attempts to blend peace with passive aggression, and without the kind of drama that usually accompanied any family gathering that included Derek. That Thursday morning, while most people were waking to the smell of roasting turkey and televised parades, I was sitting in my apartment wrapped in an oversized sweatshirt, working through revisions on a client's logo rebrand, sipping lukewarm coffee, and listening to the rain drums steadily against the windows like the world had decided to match my pace for once. It wasn't lonely, not exactly. It was peaceful in the way solitude can be when it's not forced on you, but chosen. A kind of quiet that lets you exhale in full, knowing no one is about to guilt you for not smiling enough or criticize the way you pass the mashed potatoes. My dog, Sophie, a rescued beagle with more patience than any human I know, slept curled at my feet while I reviewed design mock-ups. A candle flickered on the windowsill. Outside, the streets were empty, the city slowed to a hush, and I thought, not for the first time, that maybe this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not the blood ties or the inherited obligations, but the spaces where you're allowed to just be without having to edit yourself for someone else's comfort. It was both sad and liberating to admit that, yes, I miss the idea of my family more than the actual people. I missed the dream version, the one I'd kept alive, long after the reality had proven it unworthy. Just before sunset, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't expected to see, not that day, not so soon after the trial, and certainly not without warning. Derek. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I didn't know what to do, but because a part of me still wanted to believe he was calling to apologize, to acknowledge what he'd done, to offer something real and unscripted that didn't sound like it had been written by our mother in the background. But I knew better. Hope, when it came to Derek, was a habit I'd finally broken. I let it ring out. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door, 3 slow, deliberate taps that made Sophie bark once, then settle down again as if even she sensed it wasn't danger, but something murkier. I opened the door not out of welcome, but out of resolve, ready to look him in the eye one more time and see whatever truth he was willing to show. Derek stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes unfocused, shoulders hunched like he'd rehearsed a version of this moment, but already knew it wouldn't land the way he wanted. He didn't say hello, he didn't say sorry. Instead, the first words out of his mouth were, "Mom's not doing great. She thinks you hate her." I let the words hang there, suspended in the cold space between us, and I didn't move, didn't step back to invite him in, didn't offer any comfort or even the dignity of an easy answer. Because what he said wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was another manipulation, another way of shifting the blame, another attempt to make me the problem for not fixing what I didn't break. He wasn't there to make amends. He was there because he was afraid of what would happen if I kept my distance long enough to make it permanent. And maybe that's the most dangerous part of healing, that the people who hurt you don't fear your pain. They fear your indifference. They fear the day you stop responding, the day you no longer orbit their chaos. He looked past me into the apartment like he was trying to assess whether I'd softened or hardened in the time we hadn't spoken. And when he didn't get what he wanted, he added, "You used to be different." I almost laughed. Not out of cruelty, but out of the irony that he saw my refusal to be abused as a change in character rather than a return to it. I didn't answer. I didn't fight. I just stood there, steady, while the wind picked up outside and the last light of day caught on the edge of the window frame. He hesitated, just long enough to give me a sliver of something, maybe hope, maybe remorse, maybe just confusion, then said, "Anyway, we're doing Christmas at Aunt Rhonda's. She told Mom she invited you, so I guess we'll see." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, and I didn't call after him. I didn't close the door right away either. I stood there, one hand on the doorknob, watching his silhouette disappear down the hall, and I realized I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt separate, like I had finally stepped off a spinning wheel that had controlled me for so long, I hadn't noticed how dizzy it made me until the motion stopped. Later that night, I sat at my desk, looking out over the city lights, wondering whether I'd go to Aunt Rhonda's for Christmas. Part of me wanted to, not for Derek, not for my parents, but because she had whispered, in the middle of that awful family ambush, that I was right to speak up, right to break the silence. And maybe that was the beginning of a different kind of family, one that wasn't based on guilt or obligation, but choice and honesty, however imperfect. I still don't know what I'll do. Maybe I'll go, maybe I won't. But here's what I do know. I don't need an apology to move on. I don't need them to understand what they refuse to see. I don't need their permission to be whole. Because the real victory wasn't in the court ruling or the money or even in the confrontation. It was in the moment I stopped making myself smaller to make them comfortable. And maybe that's the quietest kind of justice. The kind that doesn't scream, doesn't gloat, doesn't demand an audience. It just exists. Quiet, strong, and irreversible.